Hello, this is Francesco Verso. I'm an Italian science fiction writer and editor of the series of books Future Fiction. And in this talk, I'm going to highlight some main trends, some books, and some important authors of Italian science fiction over the last 200 years. So, given the limited time, it will be just an introduction to Italian science fiction. And of course, that means that I will be forced to do some simplifications. The Italian science fiction started in the Middle Ages as a literature of the fantastic. Of course, there was no sign at the time, so mainly the authors were using their imagination. In Italy, in the past, the fantastic and imagination has played an important role in the development of literature and also science. Though not properly science fiction, the fantastic voyage of Dante's in the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, what is called the Divine Comedy, where using an allegory of and metaphors, the author imagines fantastic creatures, divine forces, and seducing landscapes. This particular scenario has affected the imagination of future generation of authors and many, many scholars. Along with Dante, Leonardo da Vinci has set incredible milestones in art and sciences, mostly in the era of engineering, flying machines, hydraulics, and constructions. His works have inspired millions of people across the world in the centuries to come. Moving on to the Renaissance era, the studies of Galileo Galilei, of Copernicus, and Kepler initiated the scientific observation of space and contributed to the basis of the modern physics and astronomy, while one of the first modern utopias were written in 1602 by Tommaso Campanella in The City of the Sun, where is depicted a universal republic under the rule of a high priest called the Sun, with a sort of ante litteram communism of goods and property. Moving on to the next stage, early science fiction from 19th century to 1950. An appropriate proto-science fiction began around the early 19th century with the books of Emilio Salgari, which is considered the Italian Jules Verne, pioneer of adventures for children and the masses of the time. Though he never moved from Italy, he was inspired by foreign literature and newspapers, travel magazines, and encyclopedias to write books set in India and the Far East Malaysia, along with science fiction adventures like A la conquista della luna, Conquering the Moon, and Le meraviglie del 2000, The Wonders of the Year 2000. It was during the totalitarian fascist Ventennio, the 20 year in which fascism ruled Italy from 1922 to 1943, that Italian writers came to terms with modernity. Fascism was a contradictory regime. While it celebrated Guglielmo Marconi, inventor and electric engineer, and the Italian aviators, it dreamed of a new Roman Empire. It experimented with agrarian pseudo-utopia by cleaning up the Pontine swamps, and it added a nationalistic emphasis to a secondary education system based on the humanities, whose counterpart was a vehement anti-modern rhetoric against all Anglophone things. From a cultural point of view, the avant-garde movement called Futurism upheld many innovations brought about by science and technology. It emphasized speed, technology, youth, and objects like the car, the airplane, and the industrial city. The Futurists practiced in every medium of art, including painting, sculpture, graphic design, urban design, theater, fashion, textiles, and architecture. The famous EUR area in Rome, built for the Universal Expo of 1942, was made by fascist regime under its artistic influence. The mind behind Futurism was Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, whose book Mafarca is set in an imaginary Africa describing the epic adventures of Mafarca, who, after triumphing over his enemies in battle, instead of making himself king of Africa, decides to retreat and dedicate himself to the creation of his son, Gazurma, an automaton and winged demigod. So moving on to the next phase, science fiction from the 1950 to the 1970. The proper science fiction started in Italy some years after World War II, in particular in 1952, when the weekly and later monthly magazine Urania was published by Mondadori. Urania is the longest book in series in Italy, and it has established a huge fan base. Until today, it's the most successful and popular source of international and national science fiction in the country. Another important magazine is Robot, founded in 1976 by Vittorio Curtoni, and with ups and downs, is still considered an excellent magazine. The most relevant authors of this period are Primo Levi, literary writer with scientific background that explored the possibility of science fiction in two stories collections, Storie Naturali, Natural Histories in 1966, and Vizio di Forma, Defect of Form, in 1971. His books are comparable in themes with the ones by Robert Sheckley and Kurt Vonnegut, pointing out the perception of a gap in the world we live in, a breach, a defect of form, which foils any other aspect of our civilization and moral universe. Primo Levi's stories revolve around the social impact of new technology and the alienation of industrial society. Many of his ideas inspired other stories. In Trattamento di Quiescenza, the recording of experiences lived by other persons is the same of the movie Strange Days from 1995, and the duplicating machine in Alcune applicazioni del mimete can be found in the novel The Prestige by Christopher Priest. Then there is Italo Calvino, of course, one of the few Italian authors known outside Italy. He is not considered a science fiction writer, but his fantastic speculations granted him a Nebula Award nomination in 1975 for the best novel with the Le città invisibili, Invisible Cities. His book Le Cosmicomiche, The Cosmicomics, from 1963, is a collection of stories dealing with scientific notions, mainly astronomical, to build surreal and hilarious plots. Through his fiction, Calvino connected with something extremely ancient, such as the origin of the cosmos, the beginning of life on Earth, and the evolution of the human being. Another important author is Ennio Flaiano, particularly bright and satirical writer who worked as screenwriter for the Italian filmmaker like Federico Fellini. He wrote the screenplay for La Dolce Vita in 1960. His first science fiction work is Un Marziano a Roma, A Martian in Rome, 1954, which shows the arrival of an alien in Villa Borghese, the center of Rome. The starship is fenced off, and people have to pay to see, for the money will be used for unspecified charity works by the church. The Pope and the Italian president meet the Martian, who spends all his time at banquets and cocktail parties. The alien is turned into a character of the Roman Dolce Vita, and when he gets back to his starship, he finds out that it has been seized by Roman hotel keepers. From the 90s to the 80s, science fiction and the Italian New Wave. Following the crisis of never-ending progress and the failure of political welfare promised by Italian government, science fiction analyzed the consequences of consumerism and imagined the effects on future societies and people. It's also the end of the classical hero, the stereotype of brave explorer, captain of spaceship, and enlightened businessman. In the book Quando le radici, When the Roots, 1977 by Lino Aldani, the main character, Arno, looks for his past in the future, disturbing Italy, trying to fight industrial modernization in the year 1998. Unable to cope with the values of the new society, he goes back to living in a village among the peasants, until he has to face the expropriation of land and forests by huge machines. During this period, many authors used to change their real names into English pseudonyms to be published by publishers that preferred American writers. On top of that, many literary authors published science fiction avoiding genre magazine and publishing houses because they didn't want their works to be associated with the genre. Vittorio Curtoni, in his book Le frontiere dell'ignoto, Frontiers of the Unknown, tries to highlight the reasons why science fiction has never been considered literature by the mainstream. Fortunately, his odd process of hiding our nationality is finished, although the approach of the publisher is not changed much. An interesting collective of people is worth mentioning for its critique of the system and desire to change traditional science fiction. It was called Un'ambigua utopia, whose name recalled The Dispossessed, an ambiguous utopia, by Ursula Le Guin. The group, that I like to call the Marxians, proposed a political approach to science fiction very similar to the New Wave, as their inspiration came from authors like J.G. Ballard, Brian Aldiss, Robert Silverberg, and the Russian structuralism. Moving on, science fiction from the 1980 to the year 2000, the crisis of Italian science fiction and the hybridization with other genres. The 80s saw a decline in Italian science fiction. Many authors, disillusioned by the false expectations of capitalism and consumerism, turned to the themes of religion and alternative history, like Valerio Evangelisti in his famous saga of Eymerich the Inquisitor, who investigates mysterious phenomena in medieval Europe, where the solution of the mystery lies in storylines parallel to the main one, which are projected into our present and future. Turning away from science, many writers found in hybridization with other genres a new way. Lucia D'Eramo, in her 1986 novel Partiranno, They Will Depart, tells a story of alien contact in Italy. In this story, which hybridizes science fiction with spy story, the author imagined an Italian zoologist contacting aliens and documenting her studies, while the Italian secret services, notorious for a series of scandals concerning political conspiracies, black operations, etc., keep watch on her. Science fiction mixes also with postmodernism. In the case of Associate Professor of English Literature in Milan, Nicoletta Vallorani. Her debut as a writer was Il cuore finto di DR, DR's Fake Art, 1992, a cyberpunk novel set in Italy which shows how science fiction managed to fuse with other genres. Such works suggest that Italian science fiction has perhaps moved into a period of gen cross-pollination, an hybridizing strategy, mixing science fiction, horror, historical novel, crime fiction, and satire to create literary forms that can directly express the contemporary imagination. The novel Memorie di un cuoco d'astronave, Memoir of a Spaceship Chef by Massimo Mongai, uses science fiction in a funny way, much like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, but being Italian, the story has to do with the importance of food in interplanetary relations. It also contains ideas like the principle of tolerance and equality for all races of the cosmos, while the galactic community, called Agora, is liberal, free in sexual matters, with democratic control and anti-racist. The next part is science fiction from the year 2000 to 2010, the post-cyberpunk and time travel. The birth of digital publication and the rise of small presses give new energy to science fiction in early years of the new millennium. Authors, not forced to submit stories to traditional publisher, begin to write what they think is necessary, not just following market trends, even though there is of course an explosion of commercial science fiction in hope of getting visibility. On the net, in fact, is where a group of young writers meet to create a literary vanguard called Connettivismo, Nexialism. Their names are Giovanni De Matteo, Luca Cremo, and Sandro Battisti, among others. The main idea is that a multidisciplinary approach is key to understand the complexity of postmodern time, and so they try to connect different disciplines into a kind of holistic approach to science fiction. It's not just physics, astronomy, chemistry, or mathematics that can generate the sense of wonder, but also, following the lesson of the new wave and cyberpunk, new media, information technology, big data, art, philosophy, economy, architecture, and language. The most relevant author in this movement is Giovanni De Matteo, who wrote the Manifesto del Connettivismo, the Connectivist Manifesto. And I want to tell you a little part, just to show you how it feels. We want to sing the deserted nighttime streets, monuments frozen in silence, neon subway lights, spooky outskirts, rural cemeteries, post-industrial archaeologies, lost highways, bombed-out cities, brigands' trails, soft geometries of bodies, the silence of abandoned hotel rooms, promiscuous technologies, of cows, stars, desolate planets, space probes launched toward the night, the music of dead quasars, the metaphysical darkness of the event horizons, neurolinks. We are antenna, aimed into the void. Crazed variables, badly tuned violins, out of sync chronoscopes. Using ancient mystical roots, we pursue a sharing of souls, spaces and times. The connection is a hypertextual network of realities decoded correspondences. We live in the connection. We strive toward the future. That is why we shall be all. In this book, Sezione P Quadro, Giovanni De Matteo creates special police officers known as necromancers, as the cybernetic implant they are equipped with, allow them to conduct their investigation starting from the recovery of the victim's memories. The story is set in Naples, rebuilt after the eruption of Vesuvius and the catastrophic consequences of a Third World War. The metropolis flooded by refugees has reached 6 million inhabitants and is besieged by an ecological threat of uncertain origins, an entropic mass able to regenerate itself by assimilating waste and invading areas abandoned by human activity. Two other interesting authors of this time are Lanfranco Fabriani and Francesco Grasso, who, with a mature writing, contributed to the genre with Lungo I vicoli del tempo, Along the lanes of time, Nelle nebbie del tempo, In the mist of time, and 2038, La rivolta, 2038, The Revolt. In the books by Lanfranco Fabriani, the main character Mariani is a deputy director of a central office in the Italian Time Chronograph, a secret government agency that manages travels over time and protects Italy's past from attacks by hostile foreign powers. 2038, or Revolt, is a story about the decline of society, the manipulation of information, and the power of banks. Interesting in the analysis of journalistic world, putting crisis by the interference of the regime, but also by fake and do-it-yourself news that causes the collapse of quality information and the role of guarantee of official newspapers. Moving on to the last stage. From the year 2010 to the present time, Italian science fiction goes mainstream and gets published in English. Two trends emerge in recent years. Literary authors using science fiction themes as reality gets more and more science fictional, and science fiction from Italy translated onto the English market. For the first theme is the case of Tullio Avoledo, who wrote books on parallel universes out of science fiction genre with mainstream publishers like Einaudi. The novel L'anno dei 12 inverni, The 12 Winter Year, deals with time travel, love, and redemption in a mix of science fiction and realistic narrative. In 2011, he published another science fiction novel, Un buon posto per morire, A good place to die, that won the Emilio Salgari Award. Also Vittorio Catani with Il Quinto Principio, The Fifth Principle, goes from genre into mainstream fiction. In the year 2043, the Earth is devastated by so-called exceptional events, catastrophes that violate the laws of physics but seem to agree with an uncertain fifth principle of thermodynamics, sinking of vast areas, sudden decrease or absence of gravity in certain territories, appearance of objects that create absolute void, and more. Many scenarios are outlined: a hidden auction for the privatization of Antarctica to face the global water crisis, hypercapitalism based on an economy of debt nearing total collapse, an enlarged rich-poor gap, the disappearance of democracy, legalized slavery, and communication systems similar to a psychic mobile phone. It really seems like science fiction cannot be ignored anymore, and writers are willing to talk about the present with the help of technology that are shaping our culture and society. Another important author is Clelia Farris. He is a very long time author of science fiction. She writes with a mature, harsh, extremely precise style. Her stories have nothing in common with English fiction and often deal with the loss and sense of guiltiness deriving from futuristic technologies that allow to exploit the human condition or being exploited by it. Her book, La pesatura dell'anima, The Weight of Soul, is set in an alternative Egypt where the use of metals is prohibited. houses and furniture are biotech, modified trees and modified animals serve as means of transport and communication. A fascinating place where no character explains anything to the reader, who must build it in his mind by deciphering strange phrases and neologisms. Maybe she could consider the Italian Kafka. Last but not least, her collection of short stories called Creative Surgeries has been translated in English and published by US publisher Rosarium. The translator is Rachel Cordasco, and the book will be out in 2020. Another book that appeared on the US market last year, 2019, is Next Human by Francesco Verso. This book deals about the relationship between technology and the human body and mind, about enhancement, augmentation, and anything that goes wrong while updating the human point 1 to the human point 2. And beyond that, the relationship of future society and lifestyles. The book was first published in Australia by Xum, and last year has been published in the US by Apex Books. The translator is Sally McCorry, and this is an important step because more and more Italian science fiction goes out of their borders and meets new readers. Another way to do it is through collection of short stories, for example, and I'm very happy to show the first anthology of future fiction that has been published last year by Rosarium Publishing, again shaping new dimension in international science fiction with translation with many countries and cultures, including Italian. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.